Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Danger on Delmarva. My name is Rhonda Jefferson, and I'll be your host as we explore the dark and winding roads that lead around the Delmarva Peninsula. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're a returning listener, welcome back. If you're not familiar with Delmarva, it's an area in the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States that includes the state of Delaware, Maryland to the east of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and Virginia to the northeast of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. Today's recording will be somewhat bittersweet for me as I'm honoring the man that loved me, raised me, has always been there for me, and going forward, he's not here anymore. Since I last published an episode, my family and I got to spend the last days with our father. When he came home from the hospital in Western Maryland, we knew it was a matter of time. Things kind of progressed extremely quickly. And my siblings, nephews, nieces, down to great grandnieces and nephews, as well as many cousins and longtime family friends, got to visit with him. He spent his last Father's Day in my home as he was in hospice care. So I'm grateful for the time I got to spend with him before he passed, and glad that everybody who was able to make it to see him were able to make it. Up until I got the call from the hospital, I'm not sure what procedure is on, if I'm allowed to say their names or not, if I'm not doing an episode about them, but they found or did the extra tests that hadn't been done here, but the diagnosis wasn't good. So, again, he got to come home and spend time with the family. We knew it would be his last Father's Day. He came home the Wednesday before Father's Day. So today I'm going to do an episode of a story that was in the news at the time that he was born, which was in September of 1934. So he was 89 and had wanted to make it to his 90th birthday. His last sibling, and he came from a large family as well, but his last sibling died 30 some years ago. So he was a fighter, and that's with my whole family. I had an uncle who had cancer where it felt like he would always just always get past that hurdle and fight it and, still be at the next family function. And that's the way it kind of felt with Dad too. And I was hoping that he would. But again, today I'm going to do an episode on stories, or a story that was in the newspaper at the time that he passed away. It kind of touched base in Delaware at one point, with one of the people involved being from Delaware, but the events actually took place in Centreville, Maryland. In today's episode, it will be a little bit shorter than usual, or at least I'm anticipating it to be so, just with everything going on. His services are upcoming, and I'm still trying to work on some things from there and get my son's pants hemmed, which is kind of funny considering my son is 6'1" and I'm actually having to hem a pair of pants. But as with most stories that, I do look at from decades, in this case, almost 90 years ago, I just sometimes marvel at how some of the things stay the same. Maybe the way that people may go about those things might be different, but motivation and what they expect to gain from their actions remain the same. I heard a saying a couple of days ago, and I'd fallen asleep with a documentary, on in the background, and I think that had been about an air crash investigation. But by the time that I woke up, another show was on, and it talked about a bank robber. And though I was still kind of waking up and I didn't hear the name of the bank robber or anything like that, it did describe how one man's first robbery was done with a horse as the getaway means, but on his last robbery, it was done with a car as their getaway means. So things change, evolve, and advance more quickly now than in decades or centuries past. So to see the difference of technology and its impact on society from that long ago versus today, I think just emphasizes how the same basic human needs and motives are always going to be there, even if the surroundings change. The actions reflect those needs and motivations that many humans have. It's just now many more bank robberies are done at the behest of a keyboard, a Wi-Fi connection, and probably some heavy-duty firewalls versus the old-fashioned way of a firearm, a getaway vehicle, and a mask. I also find it funny how sometimes the newspapers would report about some very mundane things, such as one person's relative visited from another part of the country and stayed at this particular hotel. Yet the events that led up to the story today, the reporting on that is pretty scarce in the newspapers. I couldn't find any information about the prior events or crimes that led up to this until after the most egregious of the crimes actually occurred, or at least the most egregious that I can find. I guess we can look at it in a way such as there are now people famous for just being famous, or who are celebrities that every little thing that they do is reported on, yet sometimes violent crimes or unrest, things that some may think should receive more coverage, don't get any at all or barely any. It just makes me sit back and think about priorities some, and actually while reviewing this case, that one of the towns I reference will be a place I'm not too familiar with. So I did find that interesting as well, especially since it's in Delaware. Plus, as I'm sure that as this took place almost 90 years ago, the town and everything would have surely changed since then. But before I get too much into today's episode, I just want to go over some of my normal disclaimers. First is that, as with most of my episodes, this will include topics that some may find difficult to listen to, such as violence, injury, and death. My sources will be linked in the description of the episode, and all of the sources for this particular case come from an archived newspaper site. It is part of a subscription service, so as usual, I'll leave a link along with the title and date of the newspaper, so if you can find it in another way, you'll have that information. And sometimes if you do click on the link, you may be able to view part of an article if you're not subscribed to that service. There'll also be links to my Facebook page and Messenger, which is normally the quickest way to get in touch. And I know in most episodes I do have links to a PayPal or Buy Me a Coffee if you would like to support the podcast. However, with some of Dad's final bills and his services upcoming, we do have a GoFundMe to help cover some of that. I'm not sure about how anything works with his, the hospital bills, I'm sure that will be coming in, or anything. Things were very different when my mother passed, as, he was her next of kin, and, it was just a lot of things are different. So I'm not sure how all that will go. Guess there's really a lot of things I'm not sure how to do in the upcoming weeks and trying to settle everything. But hopefully everything will get settled soon. But with all that being said, let's first touch base in Marshallton, Delaware, and then on to Queen Anne's County, specifically Centreville in Maryland, September 1934. So the actual story today does take place in Queen Anne's County, Maryland, and one of the people involved, a Fred Moore, is from Marshallton, Delaware. I admit I'm not extremely familiar with that area. About the only experience I have there is from when I did live in the Wilmington area, and just maybe a day or two, or even the day that I did have our first child, my husband was stopped for speeding in that area. So I think he didn't want to tell me, because it wasn't until much later that he actually mentioned it. I can imagine it would have been the day that I had the baby, because he was at a job site. Someone had to go pick him up. And then he realized he left the keys to his truck at the job site, so he couldn't actually get to the hospital until he got a set of keys. So I can imagine it actually being the day that our son was born. But as with so many towns on Delmarva, the history does go back to the 18th century. At least that's recorded, though at the time it was not named Marshallton, but Weather Hersey Bridge. And that was because of a man who built a mill named Hersey, and that was in 1765. It was the scene of George Washington and the Revolutionary War touching ground there, along with areas that later became Newport and Stanton. Another side note is my husband and I actually had our first outing together in Newport. Some mutual friends were going bowling, and he let me know that they were going bowling. So here we are 20 years, or approximately almost 20 years later. So I guess that area has some good and bad memories for me, even though I'm not as familiar with the town of Marshallton itself. But there are many buildings that are on the National Register of Historic Places, as some buildings date back to the late 1700s and even into the early 20th century, that are of some historical significance. However, the town itself is not incorporated, so it doesn't have elected officials or anything like that. It's kind of a community in that area. Now, going back to Centreville, Maryland, though, where much of the story takes place today, I'm a little bit more familiar with that. I had some very good friends who lived there, and was probably over there 2 to 3 times a week, even though I lived in Sussex County in Delaware. And so Centreville is in Queen Anne's County and is the county seat. It's much closer to the Bay Bridge than where I currently live, with Centreville being about 30 miles or so, or maybe about maybe 34, 35 minutes driving according to Google Maps, even though with me, I drive slow. But I do have to add, as far as getting over the bridge, it depends on the time of day, or if it's a holiday or weekend. Traffic there can be a nightmare, but it was convenient if we wanted to go to, say, larger malls or stores that we didn't have access to over here. Now, Centreville was also the scene of other tragic events, which I'll actually have episodes on one touches pretty close to home. It was very tragic. Going through newspapers, I still see situations that are somewhat similar today in regards to the jail that is located there. As far as Centreville itself, it also has a vast history, as far as history that's recorded, going back even longer that I could find than Marshallton. There have been documented events and time periods that track the establishment of Centreville. And as we've seen in many other episodes, looking back to changes that take place, especially in the 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries, because there was some history from even, the 17th century, that sometimes in order to try to make it easier for people to get to, that the county seat was changed to a more centralized location as compared to it being, say, very far to the east, so that those who lived in the western part of the county would have to travel further, which was a concern today, but was a much bigger concern back then, as going out may sometimes be a much more laborious process than it is today. The area that became Centreville was originally named St. Paul's Parish. And even when the county seat was changed to that particular area of land, for another 12 years, it remained St. Paul's Parish. So the county seat changed in approximately 1782, but the site had been active as St. Paul's Parish for about 100 years by that point. So again, dating back to the 17th century, and the name was changed in 1794. So again, 12 years actually after Centreville became the county seat. And the name was changed to Centreville to reflect the fact that it was more centralized so that people could get there more easily. It is also very close to the Corsica River, and with the waterways being so important as far as the development of the country, that's what allowed Centreville to, thrive. It is currently the town with the highest population in Queen Anne's. As of the 2010 census, it had just a little under 4,300 people. And just as with Marshallton, there are many homes or buildings that are part of the National Register of Historic Places, including buildings that date back to the early 1700s. And looking through some of the pictures, as well as some that I've seen in person, the architecture on some is amazing. And also seeing that buildings that have been standing for 2, even maybe close to 300 years are still, standing strong. I personally think the courthouse is gorgeous, and the original courthouse was moved, from where it was originally in Queen Anne's to Centreville. Another house is the Jackson Collins house. Again, the architecture is just breathtaking, especially in the Jackson Collins house. I really liked viewing that. And in an interesting little tidbit, there is a statue of Queen Anne that was dedicated in the 1970s, 1977, and Princess Anne, daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, was there for the dedication. Now, to the events that make up this story. So, like I said, there wasn't really any background on the crimes that were committed prior to these events, though I did see some inconsistencies with the date as to whether August 21st or August 22nd was when the first events actually took place. But what did occur is 3 men escaped the jail in Centreville. Now, from there, I do have to wonder where their final destination was, if they would try to cross the Bay Bridge or if they would head over to the eastern shore more so, to the eastern part of the shore. I would kind of think the Bay Bridge would be their first move, because once they got over that, they had, basically all of the country that they could go to. Whereas if they stayed on the eastern side of the bridge, they could still get to other areas, but they would have to go up and around as compared to just going across the bridge. Now, somehow the men had obtained a rope, and they used that rope to climb down from a second-story window. Now, Gilbert Williams was one of the men that originally escaped, but he is not going to play a major factor as far as physically contributing much to this story, but I do have to wonder if some of his actions impacted what one of the other men did a little bit later. Now, most sources that I was able to find said Williams turned himself back in to the jail, and one stating that it was in as little as a half an hour after escaping the jail. So something that is not clear is if he had separated from the other men and they knew he was going back to the jail, or if they just kind of separated and didn't really think about where he was going. And there's something that one of the other men, a Robert Wilson, says that really makes me wonder about that more. And also, if the other two men, Robert Wilson and Fred Moore, knew that Williams was heading back, did that then impact the sense of urgency that they did have? Now, with Williams going back to Centreville jail, this, of course, led to the discovery of the escape in a much more relatively quick time period than they would have possibly been found before. Now, with no description of the jail or the technology that could have been in use at the time, we do know that they would not have had anything such as, video cameras, closed circuit TV, that they could try to see if anybody was doing what they shouldn't have. So we may take those conveniences for granted today, but back then, prison guards didn't necessarily have anything even remotely close to that to try to monitor the prisoners. So theoretically, it could have been hours and hours before it was found that they had escaped. Now, as far as the time frame, with some articles saying the 21st and others the 22nd, what I believe may have happened in that is, if you go to sleep on the 21st and wake up on the 22nd, you may look back and, some of those early morning hours, you might still be thinking of it as the day before. Such as if I'm up late and I go to bed at 12:30, when I go to bed, my mind is still looking at it as the day before. So when Wilson did give a statement, I do think he may have been referring to either the late night of the 21st or early morning of the 22nd. But either way, it wasn't long before Wilson himself was recaptured. It was less than one day after he had escaped. So this did leave one remaining man, Fred Moore, who was originally from Marshallton, Delaware. Wilson was from Nashville, Tennessee, so he could have been trying to, head back to an area where he could get back to Nashville. When taken back into custody and asked about his fellow escapee, Wilson said that they had separated at some point during their escape. However, it wasn't anything that he said during the interview that caused concern or suspicion by the guards and officials at the jail. So they really had some suspicion about what Fred Moore's actual fate was. So, what was the question that Wilson asked of his fellow inmates? He asked them how long it would take a body to decompose if it was left in the woods. Now, considering the jail staff, and probably even the other inmates, already knew that he had escaped with 2 people and only one had returned, one might really think about if Wilson had thought through that question before he actually asked it. Did he wonder what the question might bring, such as more probing and even more questions? Or did he think that his fellow inmates wouldn't be suspicious and would never pass it on? So while the exact mechanism of how prison authorities found out about this statement, well, that was never really made clear, it definitely made them a little bit more suspicious about Fred Moore's fate. Now, Wilson tried to turn the blame over on Williams as to why Moore had not returned. Now, Williams had only been gone for about 30 minutes, so the fact that Wilson is saying that Williams could have somehow killed Moore and made it back to the prison in about 30 minutes seems kind of implausible. It's this that makes me think that Wilson didn't necessarily know that Williams had gone back to the prison, but we don't know that for sure. What we also have to look at here, too, is that they escaped in late August, summer. It was very hot. And it had now been about 10 days since the escape. Wilson had actually already been charged with murder. And we might hear the phrase, no body, no crime, but it's not really true. So even in 1934, they felt that they had enough evidence against Wilson to proceed with charges. This was bolstered even more when they searched Wilson's cell and found jewelry, money, even a shirt that belonged to Moore that Wilson had in his possession. Even though they said he had money, but I'm not really sure how they could tell who actually, owned the money. Was it Wilson? Was it Moore? Did he, for some reason, keep his name on it or something like that? Who knows? But they were able to identify everything as belonging to Fred Moore, and it was now in possession of Robert Wilson. And so when Wilson's body was actually found, it was quite decomposed. Moore's body had been found about 10 days after the escape, but Wilson was charged prior to that. Now, once Moore's body was found, it did go to a coroner's inquest. We don't see that as often today, but the coroner's inquest is used to really delve into the cause of death, which their conclusion was that Moore had died at the hands of another, but that they, quote, strongly suspected Robert Wilson of Nashville, Tennessee, end quote. Wilson did end up eventually confessing to the crime. He said that he and Moore were together and Wilson had gone out to try to get a car to aid in their escape. However, after trying to find one, he came back without a vehicle. Fred Moore became angry with Wilson, and according to Robert Wilson, they ended up in an argument in which he stated that Fred Moore grabbed a club. Now, to give a little bit of context, they had gone to a farm named Can Farm to try to hide after their escape. But according to the statement, there were 3 clubs where they were hiding out, and Fred Moore grabbed one. And in self-defense, Robert Wilson was able to wrestle that club away from Moore and ended up beating him to death. Wilson said that as soon as he realized that he had, quote, hit him too hard, that, end quote, that he started to panic. At that point, he just grabbed everything he could off the body, including the clothes. He was very quickly caught, though, trying to leave an area called Seward's Woods. So his actions maybe gained him a couple of more hours of freedom at the most. And in some of that time, he was trying to cover his tracks, not only of the escape, but of the crime he had just committed. Now, it's here where really the frustration takes hold in not having any background information about the previous crimes. The reason I'm, wondering about some of these is, was Fred Moore known to be aggressive? Were his criminal acts violent, or were they more white collar? Looking at Wilson's history, he had a history in Tennessee of breaking and entering as well as forgery. The charges that he was up for at the time when he was in jail was forgery. But there were never any notations or statements that violence was involved in any of those previous crimes. So, even if we knew those previous crimes, would it really matter? The previous crimes that Fred Moore may have committed, would that matter? Because even looking at Wilson's history, he had no formal history of violence that we could see. So the biggest question here would be, did Wilson really act in self-defense as Moore came at him with a club? Or was Wilson's desire not to go back to prison again, like he had in Tennessee, make him look at a situation and say that he didn't care what it took to obtain his freedom? But of course, the twist is he didn't even make it a whole day before being caught again. He took that life for, at the most, a few extra hours of freedom. And for that, with the confession that he made, he was ultimately sentenced to 14 years for the killing. Now, unless he had a long list of previous crimes or violence with those previous crimes, I really wonder if he would have ended up serving 14 years for this forgery charge. 14 years is a very long time for forgery, yes, but maybe if he had had an extremely long history, that may have made his sentence longer. But this is where I also have to question risk versus reward. I think we can all agree unequivocally that Fred Moore and his loved ones would not think that that risk was worth the reward, as Fred Moore paid the ultimate price for trying to, or actually escaping prison. But I guess nobody will ever know except Robert Wilson how this actually felt, what it felt like when he walked out of that woods and very quickly was apprehended by the police. What were his thoughts? Was he remorseful? Did he feel for Moore's family? Was it truly self-defense? But by trying to divert the blame to the third escapee, Williams, I personally don't think he could have felt much remorse if he actually tried to blame somebody else. Depending on all of the circumstances, the entirety of the circumstances, Williams could have very well gotten the death penalty, or at the very minimum, served a prison term unjustly for something that he hadn't done. But thankfully, Williams' mouth about asking questions about decomposing bodies kind of, gave himself away. But it appears as though he was trying to blame Williams prior to the body being found, even though he was being interrogated about the question that he asked and the suspicion that was now on him about, where Moore actually was. My conjecture is that Wilson knew that if the body had been found, Williams would not have been blamed. This most likely would have been because there's no way Williams could have gotten to the point where the body was found, taken the clothes and other items off the body, and gotten back to the jail in those 30 minutes approximately that Williams was gone from the jail. Also, you would have to wonder how Moore's items got into Wilson's possession, because, if Williams came back within a half an hour, he would have had to hide or give those items away, which would mean that Wilson was involved if he actually still had those items. But once the body was found again, I think Wilson understood that there was no way he could get away from the crime. So that's when he made his semi-confession that, yes, he had killed him and taken his possessions, but only in self-defense. But ultimately, Robert Wilson was sentenced to 14 years for the killing of Fred Moore. So looking at this case and comparing it to the forensic technology that we have now versus then, which really is the lack of forensic technology, even though advancements were being made to get us to the point where we are today, it was nowhere, near the capability of today. So I ask myself, what would have happened if the body hadn't been found for years? Now, eventually, I do believe it would have been found, but instead of 10 days, what if it had taken 10 years? Wilson took the watch, shirt, other things that belonged to Moore that could have identified him. So without something such as fingerprints, scars, tattoos, or anything like that, any distinguishing feature, if the body had been found years later, could they have put it together that it was definitively Fred Moore? Would the prosecutors have tried Robert Wilson without a body if it had never been found? Because I truly don't think that Wilson would have confessed without that body being found. With this exact situation as inmates escaping from a jail, if I had to sit on a jury where Wilson was being tried for the murder of Fred Moore and a body had never been found, or there was no forensic evidence of a lot of blood being lost by Moore, which they wouldn't have really been able to tell back then, especially if they didn't know where, any attack may have taken place, that, sitting on that jury, I would have a hard time convicting Wilson of a crime, because Moore's whole intent would be to get as far away from Centreville as he possibly could. So the fact that, let's say, if Moore's body hadn't been found for years, it may have made it very difficult to identify without those distinguishing characteristics, such as fingerprints or scars. So I would, as a juror, always question as to whether or not a crime had been committed. However, once a body has been found, and especially with one suspect asking how long it would take a body to decompose, that's a whole different story. And while a lot of times we do look at previous charges to try to predict, the intent or actions of a person, what they may have done in the past, may do in the future, we look at those charges, and without knowing Wilson or Moore's, we don't know what their previous activities were completely. Was it just forgery, or was there violence involved? And would that have made a difference to the outcome of this case, both whether or not Wilson would have killed Moore, if he had possibly committed other violent acts that he hadn't been caught doing before, Would knowing about those charges have made jail officials any more suspicious? Just so many questions that I have, in terms of whether or not the body had been found or not. Another question I ask is, could it have really been self-defense? Even if Wilson had not been violent before, would the thought of escaping another forgery charge and not going back to jail be enough to make him kill another man in cold blood? Or was it only when this other man turned on him that he became violent? I do find it interesting that there were 3 clubs found. Could Wilson have wrestled a club away from more? Just so many things that are left unanswered, and there's not really a lot of information there to try to determine it on our own. For one thing, if let's just say Fred Moore was 6'6", 300 pounds, and Wilson was 5'8", 150 pounds, I would find it hard to believe that Wilson could have gotten the club away from Moore. So that's why why that type of information being missing to me kind of muddles the case. So while Wilson actually confessed to the killing, was it murder or manslaughter? Or neither if it was self-defense? ? So it's with some frustration that I will leave you with those questions and ask, do any of them frustrate you as well? Do you yearn for the day that every single document on file at any law enforcement agency, court, any type of official document that's available to the public could be available online instead of them being relegated to filing bins or microfiche in buildings that you may need to make an appointment to get into, to view, and may have to travel hours to get there? Well, that day would be amazing. But for now, I think the biggest question would be, was the risk worth the potential reward? And if Robert Wilson had the chance to do it all over again, would he? Well, I guess that's 2 questions. But as I said, today's episode would be a little bit shorter, as I'm still trying to plan things, get things settled. As always, I appreciate your patience when there are gaps in getting an episode out. And I hope you don't mind, but I do want to do some research into some of the buildings that my dad helped build, even with one that has a link back to my mom's family's history. Actually, a pretty connected link in a couple of ways. From my dad and his work to my mom's family. So it might just be a additional or supplemental episode one day as I try to find out more about those buildings. I know one building became pretty infamous. Dad was building it when I was born, and someone had to go get him to come to the hospital because I was only about 7 weeks early or something like that. So of course, they had no idea I was coming then. And of course, long before cell phones. So just to take a look at those. And, when I go by buildings, I sometimes know that Dad built that, whether it's because I've been told or because of a certain style that he worked in when I moved into the house we rented before we bought. I actually looked at the steps and thought, oh, this looks like something Dad would have done. And then the landlord, who had been outside, comes in and tells me, oh, I think your dad probably did these steps. His father had known my father, and the house was one that was in the family. So he had inherited it. So he knew of my father. And I was like, oh, okay. So I was so used to seeing his style of brickwork and steps, things like that. He was a brick mason, if I hadn't said that before, I'm sorry. And worked in a lot of concrete, things like that. But, that I looked at the steps and I knew that that was something my dad had done. So if I do put that out, I'll make sure that the title is clear, that it's kind of a supplemental episode. But it is something I want to look into for him to find out about those buildings before they disappear, because that one that had a pretty strong link to my mom's family has since been torn down or taken away, might be the best description. But if I do that episode, I'll explain that a little bit more. But thank you again, guys, for bearing with me during this time. I appreciate you all listening, and I apologize it is a shorter episode, but I will talk to you guys again as soon as possible. And everyone try to have a good rest of your weekend or week, depending on when I can get this episode uploaded. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.